During the worst part of the pandemic, when it wasn't possible to meet in person, one of the things I missed the most was just getting together with a friend for coffee and talking. When I discovered the podcast Wild Precious Life from Anne-Marie Kelly, I realized how lonely I had been. Anne-Marie interviews such interesting people, musicians, writers, entrepreneurs, and people just taking their own path in this world. She opens up the conversation to where I feel like I'm sitting there at the table with them, with my steaming cup of tea in front of me, just nodding along. I believe that conversation is an art and is the most effective mode of communication that we have. If you want to hear someone who practices this art beautifully in a way that is inclusive and curious and courageous, join me in joining Anne-Marie Kelly for her podcast Wild Precious Life. You can find it anywhere you listen to podcasts. Stick around to the end of the episode to hear more about Wild Precious Life. The episode you're about to hear is part of our Season 2 series on family. Whether family of origin or family of choice, is your work a family affair? Welcome to another episode of Art Heals All Wounds. I'm your host, Pam Uzel. On this show, we meet artists transforming lives with their work.
Good morning. My daughter's making a movie. We were wondering, would it be all right to photograph it?
Sorry, ma'am, you're not allowed to take photo.
What's that?
You're not allowed to take the photo.
I'm not allowed to take
Yeah.
it? Colonialism doesn't die. Its echoes remain for a long, long time. My world was a colonial world in which the world was manicured as they wanted it to be. It was a world dominated by whites. When you're the dominating force, things are very nice, aren't they?
A really straightforward question here. Have you benefited from structural racism? If you are of European descent and this question makes you uncomfortable, I hope you'll listen to the story told in this episode. It's the story of the exploration of family history and personal identity by filmmaker Alexi Lacey. Alexi's mother, the writer Jean Bish, is a fourth-generation Fiji colonial. Jean, who grew up hating the obviously racist and inequitable system in Fiji, married a U.S. serviceman during World War II and came to San Francisco on what was called a bride ship in 1944. At the age of 82, Jean returns to Fiji after having been away for over 40 years. Alexi films her mother as she searches out the familiar places of her life there and examines her family's legacy. The product of this odyssey is the film Fiji Memory Colonial Time. This film explores the complexity of identity when it's been formed by privilege due to the exploitation of other people and the intended destruction of their culture. Even though Alexi's mother, Jean, is firmly against colonialism, she has qualms about what this journey may entail. Many of the places that were an integral part of her childhood are gone. It takes a certain kind of courage for Jean to undertake this kind of exploration. For Alexi, this film is an opportunity to profile her mother's courage and to share the bitter truths in their family's history and in the legacy of colonialism. You're listening to Art Heals All Wounds. Listen and let us inspire you. Alexandra Lacey, who goes by Alexi, is a native San Franciscan. She's been working in film and media since her late teens, including narrative, corporate, and nonprofit work. Fiji Memory Colonial Time is her first documentary feature. Her production company, Persuasion Pictures, has produced videos and coordinated oral histories for the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which makes visible the data around eviction and displacement happening due to the housing crisis. Alexi has brought her storytelling skills to many of their media projects to put a human face on eviction statistics in San Francisco and beyond. I think to understand this episode, it's important to have some background on Alexi's mother, Jean Bish. Jean grew up in colonial Fiji and spent a good deal of her time as a child and teenager writing. Her novel, Bells and Shadows, centers on life in Fiji, and excerpts are featured in Alexi's film. In my conversation with Alexi, you may hear Jean referred to as Mumsy, because that's what everyone calls her. Also, a big thank you to Nancy Takada, who saw the film at the same screening I did. She was the one who pointed out the similarities between the film and the debate over whether the history of racism and slavery should be explored in the United States. Before we meet today's guest, I want to tell you about an app called Newsly. Newsly is an all-in-one audio super app for iOS and Android. There really hasn't been an app like Newsly before now. Newsly picks up all of the trending articles on the web and reads them to you in a natural human voice. You can find any topic you're interested in, sports, politics, or art. Just select the article you want to hear and Newsly will read it to you. I've loved using this app. I listen to it when I'm commuting or when I'm gardening or while I'm cooking, anytime when my hands are occupied, but I want to listen to the news. You can also find trending podcasts from over 50 countries on Newsly, including Art Heals All Wounds. Newsly has become my go-to listening app for podcasts. If you want to try Newsly for yourself, just download it from www.newsly.me. And if you use the promo code ARTHEALS, you'll get a free 1-month premium subscription. I'll include all of this info in the show notes so that you can just click on the link and use the Art Heals promo to get your free trial. Now, let's meet this week's guest. Hi, Alexi. Thank you so much for being on this episode of Art Heals All Wounds. Can you start by introducing yourself and telling us who you are and what you do?
Yeah. Hi, Pam. Thank you for having me. I am an independent filmmaker, and I just completed a project that I've been working on for 13 years. I'm saying 13, although it's probably 14. And so that's kind of exciting for me, and also, a big transition after working on a project for so long. So yes, that's kind of where I am, and I do other projects. But my primary work has been that for a while.
Okay, and if we have time, I'm going to ask you about some of those other projects, but I did want to ask about your film that you finished, Fiji Colonial Time. Can you tell us the story of this film? Why did you make this film? What motivated you to make this film? And a little bit about what it's about. Maybe start with that.
Yeah, sure. First, one correction is the newest title, because we've gone back and forth about the title, is Fiji Memory Colonial Time.
Fiji Memory Colonial Time. Okay.
Yes, we're sticking with that one.
But that shows how freshly finished this is.
That's right. In fact, I can't say it's completely finished because we're still doing the final post color correction and audio design, but it's picture lock. So for those filmmakers out there who know what that means. It is a film about, I say that it's about the legacy of colonialism in Fiji through a family lens. So that's the very short version. So my mother was born in Fiji in 1925. She was fourth generation Fiji colonial is the term I'm using. And so it's about colonialism in Fiji, and it's about my family history, and it's about kind of the intersection of those things, if that makes sense, and how that history kind of came down to me in all of its permutations, like kind of through my mother, through her grandfather, and some of the family lore, including an incident where my great-grandfather shot a young Fijian man and was imprisoned for it in the late 1800s. So this story, kind of more dramatic story, is kind of the maybe the center or the inspiration in some ways of the film, but it kind of ripples out from there in terms of the many other stories that are that intersect with the story through time and place.
Right, right. And luckily, I got to see your screening of this film. And I'm going to add a little bit to that, if you don't mind, just as an outside observer,
Sure.
just so people know more about it. So, Alexi's mother, everyone knows her as Mumsy. So, when you hear me say Mumsy, that's who I'm talking about. I'm talking about Alexi's mother. How old is your mom now?
She just turned 96 last month. I was
Wow.
very happy to be at the film. So yes, she had me when she was older, and yes, so she's 96.
So she's 96, and you took her back on this really interesting journey that I think would be interesting for a lot of people to do, to go back to a childhood place where they really haven't been in a long time, particularly on the way that she went back. She went back sort of searching for old memories, places, people that meant something to her growing up. But your mom is a very radical human being, as are you. And so you don't just create this beautiful trip down memory lane. You also, as you said before, you're weaving in all of this legacy and history of colonialism, both in through the family lens, but also just you have other narrators in the film who are Fijian, who are giving their perspective on it. And your mom takes a really sort of courageous, unblinking look at her history and at the legacy. So it's a really fascinating film because your mother, Mumsy, is so charming and compelling that if you had made just a film about, oh, look, I'm taking my mom, who's in her 90s, back to Fiji where she grew up, I would have watched that film. But you made it so much more complex. And I'm wondering about those choices that you made and why did you choose to tell the story in this way?
Thank you, Pam. You've added it's really it's great for me to hear, your thoughts about the film because since it is so new and this is one of the first times I'm really talking about it as a completed project. Usually I've been talking about it as a work in progress. So great to hear that those are the things that you got from the screening because that's very important to me. Let's see. I might go back a little bit then to answer this question. I'd say that this film, like its origins, come way back. I almost see the origins of me as a filmmaker completely connected to my desire to make this film because it was that experience of growing up and hearing my mother's stories about this place that I'd never been to and seeing these crazy old family photos of these British people and all their layers of clothing and their buttons, like sitting very like rigidly in this like context where they didn't seem like they belonged at all, in this
Right.
very lush, warm environment. I think that I was very intrigued by those images and what was underneath them and behind them in a way. And then my mother was a writer, so she would also write about this place in a very evocative way, but she was also very anti-colonial and anti-racist in her political viewpoint. So there was always a conflict and a contradiction and a tension there as well between that and
Mm,
her love for her childhood that was very picturesque and, that she had so many fond memories of. So all of these, to me, these pieces kind of seem like a fragmented mirror or some kind of, something like that and I think that there was a desire on my part always to kind of go back there to like make those pictures come to life and also understand how these fragments kind of how they work together, whether they make one or not, I don't know. But I think that, the first time, we went to grad school together, I first did a project or like an initial version, like I don't know what it was, but a project on this grad school So it was like kind of always rattling around in my head. And then when I finished grad school, I thought, well, this would be a good time to do it. Again, I didn't think it would take 13 years. So in that time, I wanted to see Fiji for myself. I wanted to go there with my mother to have that experience. And she wanted to go back, and she hadn't been in 40 years. So anyway, that's maybe like the whole trajectory of how I got to the movie. And in my mind, maybe because of those things that I was just saying, it always was very important to me that it wasn't just my mother's story.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think I could even tell just my mother's story, because it's just, for me, this relationship between the personal and the political and its connection is so often, like, connections we don't see is so important to my work and the way I see the world. So
Right.
I really wanted to like show those connections somehow. And
Mm.
I don't know if I succeeded, but I knew that I'd have to have a slightly, I'd say, non-traditional structure to do that with. I mean, I don't think it's completely out there, but just having many different voices kind of overlapping and intersecting is what I always wanted. And to have a more documentary, I have like talking heads giving more context. I have a narrative section that is more about my great great grandfather's story, and then a more verite interwoven, the three interwoven of my mom going back to Fiji.
So was that your first trip to Fiji when you started making this film?
Yes. Yes, I had never been there.
I don't think I knew that. Well, it is very interesting, the different materials that you use. And your background before doing this film was primarily as a narrative filmmaker. So you do incorporate this reenactment of your great grandfather. What was his name? Can you remind me?
Yes, G.H. Lee.
G.H. Lee. Yes. So you do this reenactment. And I think, though, that having these different voices, especially the talking heads who can contextualize it in a way that's not so personal, really helped. Although your mom is so clear about her anti-colonialism that she could also paint a pretty good portrait. But I think that was really helpful to have that. And also, some of them were personal. You had the artist who was giving more a personal account of the legacy of colonialism as a Fijian. So it was really interesting, all the different things that you wove in there. I'm really curious about, I remember when you first started, you sort of had a log line for your film, and I don't know what your new log line is, but it was something like, if the land where you grew up was stolen, then who are you? Or something like that. And I'm wondering, does that still resonate with you? Have you shifted your ideas about sort of that little crystallized essence of the film, or where are you now?
That's a really good question, Pam. I'm so impressed that you remember that. The project was written about in an oral history thing and like article, a journal, and that was written there. So I should go back to that and probably, I have to go back and revise everything, right? All the text and everything. But I think having a film, I mean, I think any documentary film, I mean, you again know this experience of working on a film for a long time, and the documentary kind of starts to speak to you, and it changes and transforms over time. And it's also that thing where it ends, you want it to be finished, but you know it's not. And then you just have to have some kind of faith that there's going to be some moment when it reveals to you that it is finished. And I did have that experience. So that was good. But you can't tell when that's going to happen, from the beginning. So I think that log line, I still think that's super important. And I think the themes, I think that reflects the theme of identity that was always a big part of the film, and this idea of identity, particularly modern identity. This idea that my great great grandfather or great 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 grandfather still confuses me. Anyway, that he could come over from England to Fiji on this like colonial project as part of this vast colonial project that we are all in some way or other the legacy of, right? Most of us, in one way or the other. I think that would change the whole trajectory of many, many lives, right? On both impact the place that you are visiting for sure, and the people in your family who will then continue to live there for generations. And in the film, many other ways, right? It's very complex. So the project of colonialism and how it impacts us and our identities. So I think that that is at the heart of the film, this kind of searching and thinking about this question that I think often we don't think about very often. We just think, here we are, this is our lives. But it wasn't very long ago that many things got disrupted, and there was lots of dislocations that were a result of that disruption. And it's different everywhere, and it's also similar everywhere. So Fiji is a very unique story. It's a British colonial story, which is specific to their model of colonialism, their flavor. But it's also kind of like we still see, it's still happening today, right? It's still, I mean, the basic model, it's also the same everywhere. So it's just like, it's unique. I said that already, but it's unique in the same. So that affects our identities, like it's just this idea that my mother had always said, one day she would say I'm English. The next day she would say I'm Fijian. I mean, she rarely said she was American, but, but maybe now and then. Although she's lived here most of her life. So, I mean, this thing about who we choose to be, are we privileged enough to say things like that? What kind of entitlement does that involve when you say that you are of a nation that your family, your ancestors took? But, there's something I realized too over the years in terms of that log line. I also felt like it was very centered on the colonizer's story and our identity. So I like it because it's asking us to kind of face that, but I also feel like I wonder if it's too much one-sided, especially having gone through the process of trying to access more stories or tell a larger story of Fiji. Does that make sense?
It does. It makes total sense. And you're right that when you have a documentary, you have a starting off point and you have an idea. But the more you cling to that idea, the bigger trouble you'll be in. Because I loved what you said, that the documentary started speaking to you. And I think that is such a great thing to keep in mind about making a documentary. And I am curious, though, because your family, particularly you and Mumsy, you're both incredibly radical. And I'm wondering how you're talking about identity, but how do you place yourself, your own identity after making this film? What do you think? You've touched on it a little bit, but I'm still curious to know a bit more.
Well, thank you for calling me a radical. I'm not just I do my best. I mean, I think that was certainly any film like this about your family, or of course, it's also about your own identity. And I think a couple drivers around that for me for making the film is understanding my mother's identity more will help me understand my identity, because she is such a unique person, right? So having a parent who has such a unique point of view, a unique personality, and a kind of strong one, I think it tends to shape other people I know who have parents like that as well. It tends to shape you, right? So kind of understanding how my mother shaped me and how she was shaped. I think one of the more interesting things, that maybe more recent themes that emerged, was her grandfather, my great grandfather. Her grandfather, who had kind of rejected his father and the colonial mindset, at least for his time period. I mean, I'm sure it would be much lacking nowadays, and how that just affected and influenced our line of the family. I haven't shown this to my relatives, who I don't know that well, but there was many children in this family, and I know that to some of them, G.H. Lee is a hero, I'm sure, although...
This is the great-grandfather who shot the Fijian.
Yes, and who was the first one to come to Fiji. And he had also been in the Maori Wars, so he was very much, this was his worldview for sure. And so I think they might have very different thoughts about it, right? And they may disagree. And then how oral history and family lore is as well. Right. But my mother's grandfather was kind of the black sheep, because he had he had rejected his father and run away and all this. And I had heard this story many times, but I don't think that I really understood it again, in this, like, within the context of the larger political trends, or, it really shaped my mother in such a way, her mother, and then her, and then me, right? So how important those moments are, those moments of transgression or rejection of a worldview, and like kind of what makes change. And it may not seem, and how we as individuals, just by how we teach our children or the choices that we make, and somehow can see past maybe the limitations of our specific worldview, can really make important change. So I think that thinking about that, it was always kind of there, but I think, and kind of thanking him, for that, my life I probably wouldn't be here because my mother wouldn't have made the choices she made, right?
Right.
So yeah, kind of seeing that, and just seeing how that shaped me as an individual.
Well, I do want to share with you another comment from a mutual friend. After I finished watching your screening of this film, I went out in front of the theater and I was chatting with Nancy Takeda, and we were talking about how moving watching your film was. And she said something which I just thought was so spot on about the way that this journey takes place. That what you're showing in your film is that it's okay if you are from a society that privileged you and that is a very, very damaged and damaging system, to go back and look at your life through either a wider or a different lens, and that it will not destroy you to take this kind of journey into your history, your identity, and the political and social structure that you grew up in, even if you were someone who was benefiting from that structure. And that this was such a great thing to think about in terms of the absolute fear and terror so many people express over this idea of, for example, critical race theory, which I want to use that term lightly because so much of what's being proposed is not actually critical race theory. It's just completing a more complete and honest view of history, but it's been created to be a boogeyman. So what do you think of this take that Nancy had on your film?
Well, first of all, I'm so glad you told me that. Nancy is fabulous, but I didn't get to talk to her right afterwards. So I'm so happy that she got that from the film, because that is so much what I want people to get from the film. There's many things I think that can be gotten from the film. I hope that people have their own readings, but I'm also happy when people get something that I intended, right? So I definitely my hope is that people can walk away with a desire to kind of look into their own history. And especially if, again, colonialism has made all of our paths and all of our histories so complicated. I don't want to say there's anything positive about it, but we live here and today. So if there is, I think that richness actually can be something that connects us, right? If we see it that way, and that we are all fragmented, but in a rich way. But yes, I think that this idea of being able to question the role that your family, your history has played in a given structure. And I think that it's hard when you privilege from something to be critical of it sometimes, right? That somehow this seems at odds. But in fact, we have to be honest about those things. Otherwise we can't move forward. That's my opinion. And I think, my mother is complicated. We're not all perfect. We can't shed everything from everything, especially not all at once. I think that, but, things that we've learned that may be negative or may contribute to inequity and the continuation of unequal power structures. But we certainly can do our best to chip away at them. And we have to start with our own experiences and history. Again, that's kind of the connection between, I feel like there's got to be a more interesting way to say the connection between the personal and the political, but Pam, you can probably figure out a better way.
No, I think that's perfect. And, your mom didn't crumble. She didn't walk away full of self-hatred or anything, but she was also very unsparing in her take on the role that her family played in this particular colonial structure that was so damaging to so many Fijians. And that's the other reason why I think it was so important that you had those voices included in your film, that these are the voices that we need to hear if we want to understand this story.
Exactly. And I think, it's been a challenge for me the whole time in making this project because it is a project about colonialism from a colonial point of view. So that I've been very aware of it. I mean, there's nothing I can do to change who I am and my vantage point, right? I think it's very important to be open and honest about your positionality. And so I've, tried to do that in the film, and it's totally fine. I kind of think of it more for people from maybe more my point of view, or for who have benefited more from those power structures, kind of more of a film. I feel like that's maybe more my audience because I think that's appropriate. I hope, many people will like the film, but I think that it's more like, how can we speak about this? Like just what you're saying, and say like, it's okay to go and be honest and think through these questions, and you're not going to crumble. You're not going to, and maybe we could think together about how to make changes moving forward. May they be personal or more communal. So I don't know. That's the way I still feel like there's no way that it's not. I'm never going to be outside. There's going to be a problematic element no matter what. And that's just the reality. That's where we are, right? So I'm open to critique about that as well.
Yeah.
And I hope that the goal is for discussion, right? And that my mother has discussions in the film, and that she's kind of a little bit of a guide for us in that way, I suppose. And that it's about listening, like you said, listening. And, all the voices are so important, including the Indo-Fijian voices and like all the voices. I mean, there are ones that are missing always because it's already 2 hours long. So but just that conversation between all of the communities in Fiji that were affected by this invasion. I mean, there's really no other way to say it,
Right.
It's an outside invasion of a place for the use of your land. Then it always goes back to the commodification of land, right? And extraction. Right. So again, I hope that we can see the present in the film too. That was also hard because I think it's very relevant, but it's hard, I think, because it takes place in the past, most of it. And we think of this as a distant past, but it's really not distant at all. It's very, the near past. And it's still very much the way we're living today. I think that this is something that I learned just from watching the film, and this question of my mother's identity, like that was that pose question that I posed, way on that you mentioned way at the beginning of the project. And I think it's interesting because having watched the film and watched my mother with people and interact with people, that I definitely realized that a big part of her uniqueness is her Fijianness. And I say that with again, it's complicated, but definitely culturally, she's more comfortable when she's in the Fijian village. She's more comfortable when she starts to connect with some of those folks from her past that were Itoke. It's actually what the correct terminology, right, in this current moment. But with the indigenous community, it's definitely where she starts to giggle and be comfortable and be herself. So it's really interesting that to some degree that I think I definitely started to understand my mom's complex identity and which parts came from which pieces of her life and her and the place that was the Fiji that she grew up in.
An amazing line that Mumsy says in the film was that I was beginning to be afraid that I didn't exist. And so I'm wondering if that ability to connect with, you said Itoke is the indigenous community or the indigenous folks of Fiji. I wonder, your mom is not very likely to go back and connect with people who are still very much invested in maintaining the power structure that she grew up with as a child. And so I do feel like I can completely see your mom with her particular worldview being able, that these were the people from her past or people like them from her past that she's able to feel herself in a way.
Yeah, and I would say that that was kind of the beginning of the trip. She had that feeling like, yeah, like she might not exist because those things from her childhood were gone, right? And those were the
Right.
things that I think she had been creating in her memory so much as part of her identity. And I think
Mm,
especially after the second trip, the first trip it was harder. She came back and she was like, "Oh, things have changed." But then when she met Lydiana, who was this woman who she had known they had known each other as children, I think things really started to shift for her and she started to like have this experience of, I mean, intellectually, she felt, of course, that, that she was supportive of independence. But I think and the changes that would come from that. But emotionally, I think of course, she had some difficulty because so much had changed. But then when she emotionally connected, then she was like, no, the important things are still here.
mm,
And it's just different. And she actually had this like point of epiphany and she actually felt, I think, much more connected then to the essence of place, maybe.
mm.
And then, you go to the Grand Pacific Hotel and, is that really what it was that she loves about her youth, or is it really of the community that was there that she grew up with?
Mhm.
I don't know. Does
Yeah.
that answer your question?
Yeah. And part of it is that we just love our own youth and we can
Yeah.
never get it
We,
back.
right, exactly. I mean, we all feel like that, no matter what, right? I mean, but certainly not everyone has a youth growing up in Fiji, but we all
Right.
still we have something like that, right? Yes. And that's
Right.
another theme in the movie is just the is memory and just how memory fades and aging and trying to connect back to something that's disappeared through time and this relationship between time and place. And I'm very interested in those things too. So those are a little bit maybe more wider and I don't know, esoteric. I don't know if that's the right word then.
I know. But
That
yeah. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the other work that you do. You're very, very involved with issues around the housing crisis, displacement, gentrification happening in San Francisco. And I'm wondering if you could talk about the work that you do there in that context.
Sure. On the other side of my family, I'm like fourth or fifth generation San Franciscan, and my grandparents actually worked in housing rights in the 80s and 90s, might have started in the
Mm,
70s, and helped to bring rent control into the city and helped to fight for that. And were co-founders, I mean, along with other folks of the Housing Rights Committee, which used to be the
mhm,
St. Mary's Housing Rights Committee. So I was living abroad, and when I came back and started working on this film, somehow I drifted into this work. I feel like it was connected in my mind because I think of modern day gentrification as just basically the process of settler colonialism, only in an urban neighborhood scale. So I was studying and like reading all about colonialism for the film and doing interviews with these great academics. And then I happened to be working at the Academy of Art in the architecture department and reading some urban theory and then just seeing the gentrification around me in the city and just, being very, of course, saddened by it a lot as having grown up here and seeing how people were just being displaced, especially certain communities, and how my friends of mine couldn't stay here anymore. And so it was natural for me to get involved in that work. I hadn't really done political work since I was a teenager, or activism, I guess. I had kind of
mhm,
started down the artist route. And I really felt like this was an opportunity for me to start bringing those things together. So I
mm,
started doing work with the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project and just doing like tenant videos. And so I've done quite a few of those now with some different organizations around gentrification and housing instability and insecurity and how folks are responding to those things, how they're fighting against them, resisting them, and also how it's reshaping the city sometimes in a way that is less, where artists and people of color and working class people are starting to disappear. So yeah, so I think that working on the film and doing that work at the same time, it's kind of like informed each other. They've informed each other, and that's been really great. Sometimes these things just they connect and they come together in your work. somehow.
Mm.
Subconsciously, you're being driven towards those things, I think. I did do a project with a lot of other amazing artists and oral historians called the Black Exodus Project. It's a zine project about the African American experience in San Francisco and the displacement of that community and resistance by that community to stay here. So that's, I feel great about that project. I think it's a great project, and we're hoping to continue it on the web, and hopefully others can take it on and to continue to grow it as well.
Speaking of that, where can people find out more about you, your work, and even that zine? Any place you want to point people to where they can learn more?
That's a good question. I do have a website for the film called FijiTimeFilm.com, and it may change. So maybe when this actually plays, I can send you some more information. You can check out a lot of the work by the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project at antievictionmappingproject.com. And there's a page for the Black Exodus Project. You can also just search Black Exodus and you'll find that page pretty fast, I think. And they do a lot of other amazing work as well. I also worked with another filmmaker. This was her main project, a film called Tenants Rise Up, which is also on the Mapping Project website, which is great about local tenant organizing in 3 communities in the Bay Area. So I worked pretty intensely with her on that, and we're hoping to get that out too.
Well, thank you so much for coming and talking about your film. There's so much to unpack there, and I feel like we could keep talking about it much longer than we have. But I think it's just such a valuable way to think about diving into your past. If you are of European descent and you've benefited from the different structures, whether here in the US or in other former British, French, European colonies. So it really was an amazing, great project. I think for that purpose, I agree. I feel like I'm your audience. I feel like anyone of European descent is your audience. So I hope people see it.
Thank you. And just to remind that we are currently in a colonized place as well.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Alexi. And I just appreciate your effort for making this film, because people don't understand how hard it is to make an independent documentary film, and to carry something through for 13 years is really an amazing thing, but it's also not that unusual for independent documentary filmmakers. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Pam, and thank you so much for, your support always, and for helping me talk through things about the film. It's been very useful to me, and I appreciate that.
You're listening to Art Heals All Wounds. I'm so glad that Alexi Lacey joined me on this episode to talk about her film, Fiji Memory Colonial Time. If you want to learn more about this film, you can visit the website fijimemory.com. That's FIJIMEMORY.com. You can also find out more about Alexi's other film work by visiting her website, persuasionpictures.com. That's PersuasionPictures.com. Also, check out the art from Wanga Vuichiketi, the artist featured in Fiji Memory Colonial Time. The spelling for that is WAQA, new word, VUIDREKETI. You can find him on Instagram. His work is beautiful. To see the great work being done by the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, including the Black Exodus Project zine, you can find them at antievictionmap.com. That's evictionmap.com. We'll have all of these links in the show notes so that you can find them easily. The music you've heard in this podcast is Yellow Light District by Lobo Loco. Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 15 in D major was performed by Karina Galanian. The opening of this episode includes excerpts from the film Fiji Memory Colonial Time and beautiful music by Barbara Higbee and Remus. This podcast was edited by Eva Hristova. I'm so glad you listened to this episode of Art Heals All Wounds. If you liked this episode, we'd love to have you follow the show to get more stories about artists and their work. Just click the follow option on whatever app you're listening from right now. And if you know someone who you think would enjoy this podcast, sharing it would absolutely make my day.
What is it you want? I mean it. If you really got to choose, if you had a little magic, what would you want to do with your life? Sure, some of us would quit our jobs and see the world, climb that mountain or walk along the beach. But then what? Are there problems you would solve?
I raised money for the New York Food Bank, and I think we raised enough for 200,000 meals.
Wrongs you would make right?
We will say we don't want to take care of any of these things while we're looking at the consequences of not providing those safety nets, right? COVID didn't have to be this bad.
Whose forgiveness would you seek? I was reading it. I'm like, I think I might be the villain of this story. I'm not on the team. In fact, I'm shaking the book hard. And I'm like, oh, no. What wounds might you heal?
You know, I feel like I should just throw up a little flag here to say that one of the unacknowledged conditions of the American healthcare system is the way its bureaucracy itself is a wounding.
And what are you waiting for?
I feel held, I feel seen, and I feel loved.
Our days may be messy or complicated or broken, but they are ours. And I think we can do better, listen harder, and love more deeply. We can find our way to something more. I'm Anne-Marie Kelly, writer, teacher, learner. Wild Precious Life is a podcast about dreaming big, digging in, and connecting across distance, division, and loss. We are all hungry for those connections right now. In each episode, I talk with prize-winning writers, musicians, entrepreneurs, and wanderers who remind all of us how we can make the most of the time we have. So meet me here. Let's walk and talk and dream and discover what it means to be wild, precious, and brave. Subscribe and follow Wild Precious Life on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, and get the first episode in your feed as soon as it comes out. See you soon.